Welcome, everyone. We're looking at England now, and we'll look at how their history kind of shapes with this idea of absolutism. As you can kind of see in the title, it doesn't do very well. In England, we have more of a constitution monarchy, which kind of separates it in this particular age compared to all the other European nations. We begin, though, with the idea of absolutism in England with Charles I. He actually passes laws that kind of support the monarchy, where he needed Parliament to levy taxes, but he actually tells his son, I'm thinking of the wrong person. I was thinking James I. James I actually tells his son, you got to be stronger than Parliament. So whenever Charles needed Parliament, he tried to kind of go around them. And one way that he did this was through the Petitions of Rights and implementing a ship money tax, where he didn't call Parliament for the need to access tax revenue. So in England, you do see the early stages of absolutism, but it doesn't quite work very well. In addition, Charles I kind of reinstitutes the Catholic rituals into the English church, and people began to see this as a bridge towards Catholicism coming back. So if you saw that video of Henry VIII and basically the elimination of the Catholic Church in England, you have the Reformation there. The church tried to separate itself from the Catholic Church in England. And in this example, Charles I, he didn't try to bring it back, but people perceived it in that way. There's a few other things, but again, for the sake of argument, we're going to kind of move it along. In England, you do have a civil war, and this civil war causes a lot of chaos where they actually kill the king. So we kind of right away see that the concept of absolutism doesn't work very well in this particular kingdom. They actually chop his head off because they just felt like Parliament was being bypassed. And during this Civil War, there's a lot of movements happening, a lot of things taking place. One of them is this early movement that kind of models itself after Locke, if you can remember the first video. The Levelers kind of advocated for these kind of basic, what we would call basic rights, right? Freedom of speech, that the Parliament should meet, that people should have religious tolerance, that they should implement a republic rather than a monarchy, and that they should implement male suffrage, which means people, particularly men, should have the right to vote. So today that might not sound very radical, but at this time, where Charles I did see himself as an absolute monarch, it is definitely very, very radical, very new, but again, models itself after that idea that we presented by Locke, that people are born with certain rights, and by people we mean males. There's another kind of movement that's just kind of interesting, and they're called the Diggers. These are people who are living in the countryside, and this is all during the English Civil War, that are promoting this concept of communism before communism even exists. Most of these people are not thinking of it in ideological terms, but they're just, addressing their needs for that moment. And it's just quite interesting what's happening in England, because we obviously are influenced by many of the movements that happen there. And these are just two. There's a few more, but these are just two that stand out. One's more in the urban center, and the other one is more in the outskirts of communities. However, Cromwell during the Civil War becomes Lord Protector, and he starts to try to bring in kind of create a united kingdom. He goes to war with Scotland and Ireland. It gets too expensive. He disbanded Parliament and made himself basically king, if you will, without the actual coronation. And this causes people to kind of question him. He also passed legislation that banned newspapers, or people were reading other people's not emails, reading other people's mail, and he was spying on people, which caused a lot of fear of this kind of of this style of government. So what the English end up doing is bringing back the monarchy. So typically I would have you read a section, and if you have a minute, I would suggest you read the Bill of Rights, because once they get rid of Oliver Cromwell, they implement a Bill of Rights, which is directly kind of influenced by the Magna Carta. If you can remember, the Magna Carta in the Middle Ages was that document where people were complaining about the king taking away the noble's power. Well, this document basically does the same thing, trying to curb his authority against the nobility. So again, you can read those on your own, but what happens in the end, particularly with the Bill of Rights, is that there's an event called the Glorious Revolution, where what they end up doing is replacing James, because they reinstitute the monarchy, and they get rid of him because he creates this this kind of fear that in England Catholicism was going to come back. So the Parliament actually joins forces with one of his daughters, who happens to marry a noble from the Netherlands, and his name is William of Orange, and they invite him to come rule England. And to tie it back to the Bill of Rights, basically what Parliament did was ask William to follow what the Bill of Rights state. And again, it's a list of things, but this kind of sums it up in a very general way. Is number one, kind of noting that the king's power is limited, right? They kind of force him not to have a standing army, because armies are used against nobles and parliament. And he also kind of forced them to have Parliament as a separate entity, as a separate branch of government. So kind of looking back to that idea of Hobbes and Locke, remember in Hobbes, Parliament, the legislative branch is represented in the monarch. Here they're doing quite the opposite. They're actually breaking away from the monarchy, and Parliament is its own authority. And the king is in the executive branch, right? A different authority. And it's called the Glorious Revolution because it's nobody dies, and Parliament kind of takes control of government in England, which is very different from what we saw in France. The next example that we'll look at is Russia.